Dr. Eleanor Graves had always been drawn to the unknown. A historian with a reputation for exploring the boundaries between myth and reality, she had spent her career digging through ancient manuscripts, searching for hidden truths. But even for her, Stonemire Library held a mystique she couldn't resist. As she stood outside its doors, gazing up at the towering stone structure, a chill ran through her. The library loomed as if it were alive, its dark, ivy-covered walls breathing with centuries of secrets. Windows stretched high above, their glass panes cracked and fogged, casting dim shadows across the steps. The librarian met her at the door, her face obscured beneath the brim of a large hat. Her movements were deliberate, each step and gesture weighed down by something Eleanor couldn't quite place. "Dr. Graves, I presume," she said in a low, almost reverent tone, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the silence that enshrouded the library. "Yes," Eleanor replied, reaching out to shake the woman's hand. The librarian's skin was cold to the touch, and her grip was firmer than Eleanor expected. She couldn't help but notice the woman's watchful eyes, as if they saw more than what was visible on the surface. "You are free to study as you requested," the librarian said, handing her a set of heavy, rusted keys. "But remember, do not read aloud. The library has rules." Eleanor hesitated, her curiosity piqued. "Why? What happens if I do?" The librarian's expression remained impassive. "Stonemire has its reasons. I suggest you follow them." The warning sent a thrill through Eleanor, heightening her anticipation. She thanked the librarian and pushed open the heavy doors, stepping into the heart of the library. The doors of Stonemire Library closed behind Eleanor with a weighty finality, sealing her within the shadows and silence. She took a deep breath, letting her eyes adjust to the dim lighting as she scanned her surroundings. The library was vast, larger than she'd imagined, with aisles upon aisles of towering shelves that disappeared into darkness. Dust particles floated lazily in the stale air, disturbed only by her movements. The architecture was remarkable, an intricate fusion of Gothic and Victorian styles. Dark wooden shelves reached up toward a vaulted ceiling, painted with murals that had faded into indistinct shapes and colors over the years. Candles flickered from sconces mounted on the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that gave the room an unsettling, haunted glow. Eleanor felt a shiver pass over her as she clutched the keys the librarian had given her. Each key was labeled with an engraved number, and there was something about them, cold to the touch and unusually heavy, that made her uneasy. She slipped them into her bag, shaking off her apprehension. She was here to work, after all. After a quick glance at her surroundings, Eleanor made her way toward a small reading alcove tucked behind a set of shelves. She chose it for the privacy it offered. She'd need complete focus for the research she had planned. As she settled into a worn leather armchair, the silence closed in around her. There was something almost reverent about it, as if the library itself were watching, waiting for her to begin. Reaching into her bag, Eleanor pulled out her notebook, pens, and the list of texts she'd come to study. Her fingers brushed the edges of an envelope tucked at the bottom of her bag, the permission letter granting her access to Stonemire's restricted section. The librarian had stressed the gravity of her access, emphasizing that she was the first person allowed to read these particular texts in over a century. Her first selection was a leather-bound tome titled Obscura Arcanum, a collection of writings rumored to explore ancient and forbidden knowledge. The book had no author, no date, just its title stamped in faded gold on the cover. She gently opened it, marveling at the careful flowing script on its pages. As she read, time seemed to slip away. The library was so still, so deathly quiet, that Eleanor became acutely aware of her own breathing, the scratch of her pen as she took notes, and the occasional creak of wood settling. Her surroundings faded into the background as she delved deeper into the text. An hour passed, then another. Just as Eleanor finished jotting down a passage, a faint sound broke the silence, a soft rustling, like the turning of pages. She paused, holding her breath. The sound came from somewhere behind her, hidden among the rows of towering shelves. "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the thick silence. Nothing. Eleanor's rational mind dismissed the noise as an effect of the old building settling. but a tingling unease crept up her spine. She'd read countless accounts of scholars who had been driven to madness by their own imaginations, and she wasn't about to let herself fall victim to the same fate. Shaking off the chill, she returned to the Obscura Arcanum. Her fingers brushed the pages, tracing the flowing Latin text, her mind drinking in the secrets held within. The lore was tantalizing. Stories of ancient rites, arcane symbols, and forbidden knowledge that stretched back to civilizations lost to time. Then she stumbled upon something intriguing. A passage spoke of a ritual that could allow communication with the departed, a practice so dangerous it had been forbidden even among practitioners of the dark arts. Intrigued, Eleanor leaned closer, straining to decipher the archaic script. She felt the air around her grow colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. Ignoring it, she continued reading, her eyes fixed on the words. That was when she heard it again. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was coming from behind her, and it was so close that she could almost feel the breath on her neck. Swallowing hard, Eleanor turned around, expecting to see an empty aisle stretching into darkness. But her eyes widened in shock. There, at the end of the row, stood a figure. A man dressed in clothes from another era, his face obscured in shadow. He was staring at her, unmoving. Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest. She blinked, her vision wavering, and the figure was gone. Taking a shaky breath, she tried to steady herself. Just an illusion, she whispered, convincing herself that it was her overactive imagination. But a feeling of dread settled in her gut. She glanced at the book in her hands, wondering if the ritual she'd just read about had somehow awakened something. Determined to shake off the encounter, Eleanor closed the Obscura Arcanum and placed it back on the shelf. She moved to another section of the restricted area, looking for a text on medieval necromancy. As she ran her fingers along the spines of the books, her hand brushed against a piece of paper sticking out from between two volumes. Frowning, she pulled it free. It was a loose sheet of parchment, yellowed with age and covered in frantic scrawls. Most of the writing was illegible, as though someone had written in haste, but one sentence stood out, clear and desperate. "They are watching. Do not stay after dark." A chill ran through Eleanor as she read the words. Her eyes darted around the library, half expecting to see another spectral figure lurking among the shelves. She stuffed the note into her bag, feeling a wave of unease wash over her. But curiosity burned within her, and she couldn't resist the pull of the forbidden knowledge that filled these shelves. Ignoring the warning, she selected another book, this one heavier and bound in black leather. As she read, the disturbances grew more frequent. Every few pages, she would catch a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, or hear the faint murmur of voices that would stop as soon as she turned her head. Each time she tried to shake it off, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But the sense of being watched grew stronger, becoming almost oppressive. At one point, she thought she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the aisles behind her. She froze, her hands gripping the edges of the book, waiting for the sound to stop. But the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she stood, her eyes scanning the darkness. The only light came from the dim candles scattered throughout the library, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and warp. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice trembling. Silence. Eleanor took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding. She moved toward the end of the aisle, peering around the corner, but saw nothing. Just the endless rows of shelves fading into darkness. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the library, startling her. She whipped around to see that the book she had been reading had fallen to the floor, its pages splayed open. It had been lying securely on the table, and she was certain she hadn't touched it. Slowly, she approached the fallen book. As she reached down to pick it up, she felt an icy breeze brush past her, chilling her to the bone. That was when she heard it. A voice barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. "Eleanor?" The voice was soft, almost gentle, but the sound of her own name spoken in the empty library sent a spike of terror through her. Eleanor backed away, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She glanced around, searching for the source of the voice, but saw only shadows. Clutching her bag, she turned and hurried down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The library seemed to close in around her, the air growing thick and oppressive. She had to get out, had to leave before something worse happened. As she reached the entrance, she felt a presence behind her, cold and heavy, pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't dare look back. Fumbling with the keys, she unlocked the door and slipped out, the heavy doors slamming shut behind her with a deafening thud. Eleanor left the library in a daze, her mind racing with questions and fears she could hardly make sense of. The cold, heavy presence that had lingered behind her seemed to cling to her, even as she walked down the narrow cobbled street back to her lodgings. She felt as though she'd taken something from the library, or rather, that something had followed her. Despite the librarian's warning not to stay after dark, Eleanor was resolved to return. She had barely scratched the surface of the knowledge hidden within Stonemire's walls. Sleep eluded her that night, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadowy figure she'd glimpsed between the shelves, his face obscured but his presence undeniable. She could still hear the faint echo of her name whispered in the silence of the library, a sound that seemed to cling to the corners of her mind. The next day, Eleanor steeled herself and returned to Stonemire Library just as dusk settled over the town, casting the ancient building in a sinister light. The librarian awaited her once again, but this time her expression was unreadable, as if she knew more than she let on. "You returned," the librarian murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Eleanor replied, feigning confidence. "There's more I need to study." The librarian's gaze was penetrating, as if she could see straight through Eleanor's resolve. "Remember my warning, Dr. Graves. There are parts of Stonemire best left undisturbed." With a nod, Eleanor walked past her and made her way back to the reading alcove. The library seemed darker tonight, the shadows thicker, more ominous. The dim candlelight cast warped silhouettes that shifted and wavered with each flicker, as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing in anticipation of her presence. As she settled into her chair, she reached for the Obscura Arcanum once more, determined to piece together the meaning of the ritual she'd found. The library's stillness was a palpable force, pressing down on her shoulders, thickening the air until each breath felt labored. Just as she began to read, she heard the faintest rustle of pages from an aisle nearby. This time, the sound was unmistakable. She froze, straining her ears, her pulse quickening as the noise continued, punctuated by the occasional faint thud, as if someone or something was moving books around, searching. "Is anyone there?" she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. Silence. Eleanor's heart pounded as she stood and crept toward the sound, her curiosity warring with the growing dread that coiled in her stomach. She moved slowly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, until she rounded the corner of a nearby aisle. There, nestled among a pile of old dust-covered books, lay a notebook. It was battered and weathered, its cover cracked and faded with age. She picked it up, her fingers brushing over the worn leather, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was shaky, as though written by someone in a state of panic. The entries began innocuously enough: notes on research and findings, observations on obscure texts, musings on the library's layout. But as she flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The entries became erratic, each one more desperate than the last. Mentions of strange noises, flickering shadows, and the feeling of being watched filled the pages, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she read. "They are watching me. I feel their eyes every time I turn my back. They move when I'm not looking. I cannot leave. I have tried, but the door won't open." Her breath caught as she read the final entry. "I hear them. They whisper my name. I must finish the ritual. If I don't, I'll never escape." A cold dread settled in her stomach as she flipped through the empty pages that followed. The writer had vanished without a trace, leaving only his frantic notes behind. Eleanor closed the notebook, her heart pounding as she looked around the dim aisle. She could feel it now, the oppressive energy in the air, the sense that she was not alone. The shadows seemed to thicken around her, closing in like silent spectators. Returning to her alcove, she placed the notebook on the table and sat down, gripping the arms of her chair as she fought to steady her breathing. But the moment she closed her eyes, the whispers began again. They were soft at first, like distant murmurs carried on a breeze, but they grew louder, filling her ears with a cacophony of indistinct voices. "Stop it," she whispered, clutching her head. But the voices didn't stop. They were relentless, each one merging with the next, a chaotic blend of pleas, warnings, and something darker, a low, sinister chant that sent chills down her spine. Driven by desperation, Eleanor reached for the Obscura Arcanum and flipped to the page detailing the ritual. She read the incantation silently, tracing the symbols with her finger, trying to decipher their meaning. Her pulse quickened as she realized the ritual was a form of summoning, a means to commune with spirits trapped between worlds. As she stared at the symbols, a thought began to form in her mind, an urge compelling her to speak the incantation aloud, to see if the ritual would quiet the voices and allow her to uncover the truth. But the librarian's warning echoed in her mind. Do not read aloud. Eleanor hesitated, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the page. Her eyes flicked up to the shadows that gathered around her, watching, waiting. The compulsion grew stronger, an irresistible pull that seemed to resonate within her very bones. Without fully realizing it, she began to whisper the words, her voice barely more than a breath. The moment the first syllable left her lips, the air around her changed. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows seemed to ripple, converging toward her like a dark tide. The room filled with an unnatural silence, so deep and heavy that it felt as though time itself had stopped. The whispers ceased, replaced by a single disembodied voice that echoed through the library. "Eleanor?" The voice was deep, resonant, filled with a sadness that was almost tangible. She looked around wildly, trying to find the source, but all she saw were shadows. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The air shifted, and a figure began to take shape before her. A man, his face obscured in shadow, dressed in the tattered remains of what might have been scholars' robes. His eyes were hollow, empty, yet they held an unspoken plea, a desperate need that struck a chord deep within Eleanor. "We were trapped here," he murmured, his voice a ghostly echo, "bound to this place by our own ambition, by the knowledge we sought." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. The spirits of the researchers who had disappeared in Stonemire Library over the years, they were still here, bound to the library, unable to escape. "Why? What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure reached out, his hand passing through hers, and Eleanor felt a surge of cold that pierced her bones. "We delved too deep," he whispered. "The knowledge we sought, it is not meant for the living. We are cursed to remain here, forever tied to the forbidden secrets we uncovered." As he spoke, more figures began to materialize around her. Men and women, their faces twisted in agony, their hollow eyes filled with despair. They moved silently, each one bound by the same fate, trapped in an endless limbo within the library's walls. Eleanor backed away, her heart pounding as the weight of their presence bore down on her. She could feel their despair, their longing for freedom, and it overwhelmed her. "Is there a way to free you?" she asked, desperation tinging her voice. The first spirit shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on her with a sadness that tore at her soul. "Only one who understands the truth can release us," he murmured. "But to do so would mean taking our place. The library demands a sacrifice." The words hung heavy in the air, and Eleanor's blood ran cold as the implications sank in. To free these trapped souls, she would have to bind herself to the library, to surrender her own freedom and become part of its eternal curse. No, there must be another way," she whispered, her voice breaking. But the spirits remained silent, their hollow eyes watching her, waiting for her decision. The shadows closed in around her, and the weight of the library's curse pressed down on her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. Desperation flooded Eleanor's mind, and she stumbled back, clutching her bag, as she tried to make her way to the door. She couldn't stay here. Not tonight, not after what she'd seen. The spirits' anguished faces burned into her memory as she fled, their silent pleas following her as she made her way out of the library. Eleanor burst out of Stonemire Library, gasping as she escaped into the cold night air. The oppressive weight of the shadows and voices lifted, but the chill in her bones remained, a constant reminder of the spirits still trapped within the ancient walls. Her mind spun with the spirit's words. The library demands a sacrifice. How could she free them? The idea of giving up her own life, her dreams, her research was unimaginable. Yet the tortured faces of the spirits haunted her. They were lost souls, scholars like herself, all drawn to forbidden knowledge that had cursed them. The next morning, exhausted but resolute, Eleanor sought out any information she could find on the library and its haunting. She pored over records in the town's historical archives, piecing together fragments of Stonemire's dark history. What she discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. In the late 1800s, a renowned scholar named Lucian Ashcroft had taken up residence at Stonemire Library, conducting research on ancient occult practices. Desperate to uncover the secrets of life and death, Ashcroft had attempted a powerful ritual, one that supposedly opened a bridge between the worlds of the living and the dead. But something went terribly wrong. Ashcroft vanished without a trace, and rumors spread of others who had disappeared, lured by the library's forbidden knowledge. The records stated that Ashcroft had been obsessed with a ritual that promised eternal knowledge. But the price was steep. Anyone who attempted it was bound to the library, eternally cursed to haunt its halls. Ashcroft's notes hinted at an alternative to the ritual, a reversal, a way to close the rift he'd opened, but the details were maddeningly incomplete. Eleanor's heart raced as she read the final passages of Ashcroft's notes, which hinted at a ritual of release. It required both a sacrifice and an understanding of the library's true nature, a willingness to face the consequences of forbidden knowledge. Eleanor felt the weight of the spirits' gazes upon her once more. They were watching, waiting for her decision. With a heavy heart, Eleanor returned to Stonemire Library as the sun dipped below the horizon. She knew that to attempt the ritual meant risking her life, perhaps even her soul, but she couldn't abandon the spirits to their eternal prison. The librarian was nowhere to be seen as Eleanor entered, and the vast halls seemed eerily silent, as if the entire library was holding its breath. Eleanor carried with her the notebook she'd found, Ashcroft's notes, and the Obscura Arcanum. She returned to the alcove where she had first heard the whispers and laid out the books before her, determined to see this through. As Eleanor began to chant the words she'd pieced together from Ashcroft's notes, a dark energy filled the air. Shadows crept toward her, coalescing into shapes that took on vaguely human forms. The spirits of the library watched, their hollow eyes fixed on her every movement, their expressions a mix of hope and fear. "Ancient keepers of this place," Eleanor intoned, "I seek to undo what has been done, to free those bound by knowledge too great for mortal minds." The words seemed to resonate in the air, and the ground trembled beneath her. Dust and books rattled on their shelves as if the library itself was rebelling against her. Eleanor's voice grew louder, more forceful, as she repeated the incantation, pouring her will into every syllable. Suddenly, the shadows surged forward, surrounding her. Cold tendrils of darkness wrapped around her limbs, holding her in place, and a wave of voices filled her mind. A torrent of pleas, accusations, and warnings. "You cannot undo what has been done," a voice hissed, filling her with a bone-chilling dread. "Knowledge has a price, and you will pay it." Eleanor struggled against the grip of the shadows, her determination unwavering. "I will pay whatever price is demanded, but these souls will be freed." With a final burst of strength, Eleanor completed the incantation, shouting the last words with all the power she could muster. The shadows recoiled, writhing as if in agony, and the spirits around her let out a collective sigh, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. A brilliant light filled the library, cutting through the darkness and bathing the shelves in a warm glow. One by one, the spirits faded, their forms dissolving into wisps of light that floated upward, vanishing into the ether. The library fell silent once more, but the air was lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Eleanor collapsed to the floor, her body trembling from the exertion. She could feel the energy draining from her, as though the library itself was siphoning away her life force as payment for the spirit's release. But as she lay there, her vision fading, she felt a sense of peace, knowing she had freed those trapped souls. When Eleanor awoke, she was lying in a hospital bed, her body weak and frail. She later learned that she had been found unconscious on the steps of Stonemire Library, as if someone or something had carried her out. The librarian was there, her expression a mixture of sadness and pride, as she explained that Eleanor had succeeded where so many others had failed. But Eleanor knew the price she'd paid. The experience had left her irrevocably changed. Her once sharp mind now struggled with simple tasks, as though the library had taken not only her strength, but a part of her intellect as well. Weeks passed, and Eleanor tried to move on, but the library's shadow lingered in her mind, a constant reminder of the knowledge she'd uncovered and the spirits she'd freed. She could still feel the faint presence of those she had released, their gratitude a quiet comfort in the back of her mind. As she prepared to leave the town of Stonemire, Eleanor visited the library one last time. She stood in front of the grand entrance, gazing up at its darkened windows, feeling a strange sense of completion. The library was silent, its ancient secrets hidden once more, but Eleanor knew that the curse had been lifted. Yet as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of a figure in one of the windows, a shadowy form watching her, its gaze unblinking. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the truth. Some spirits can never truly be freed. Eleanor walked away from Stonemire Library, the shadow following her in her memory, a lingering reminder of the dangers that lurk within forbidden knowledge.